This is Halloween. Hello my friends, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane and I paint crap on my face. Also, surprise, it's Tuesday. I normally upload my videos on a Sunday, but for this particular video, it felt fitting to upload it on today being the 1st of October, i.e. welcome to a surprise spooky season special. Jesus Christ. Welcome to a surprise spooky season special of monsters, myths and makeup, which if you don't know is a little series that I have on my channel where I do some kind of makeup look inspired by a certain mythical creature or folklore story, and I talk about the origins of said creature or folklore story. But yes, October is finally here and we have got some big things coming this month. I've changed up my background and I can't tell if I hate it or not. So we'll see how long that lasts. But before we jump into today's story, just a little side note, I've been incredibly busy recently because for the entire month of October, I will be posting a new look every single day. I have finally jumped on the bandwagon of doing the 31 days of Halloween makeup, and it's a lot. I will be posting every day on shorts, reels, Instagram, TikTok, posts, I will be posting multiple times a day on all platforms for the entirety of October, so make sure you are following me on those other platforms so that you don't miss anything that doesn't get posted here. And I have a few more monsters, myths and makeup videos that I'm planning to do with a bit more of a spooky edge to them. Not to be that guy, but make sure you're subscribed and you've hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any of the updates or videos that go live during the spooky season. I'm gonna have to put a counter up for every time I say spooky in this video. Whilst I was planning out the looks that I was going to be doing for the 31 days, it got me to thinking of sort of Halloween related myths and stories and legends and things that I could look into to tie it in with this series, which led me to think of Halloween itself. So I ended up doing a little bit of research and there is a lot of history associated with the history of Halloween. There's a lot of superstition around Halloween and certain Halloween traditions, as well as various folklore and one or two little legends. So I thought it would be a really fun way to kick off the Halloween season by looking into Halloween. I'm going to be changing my contact lenses out at the end, but let me just go do a quick change and then we will get stuck into where the hell Halloween came from. If you want to know any of the products that I'm using throughout this look, I will list all of them in the description box below. So Halloween, especially in places like America and to an extent the UK, is kind of a big deal. I'm like 98% sure it counts as like $1 billion industry now. It's crazy. And obviously alongside Halloween there are various traditions and practices, games that are played, things like that. Despite America being probably one of the biggest sort of celebrators of this holiday, and I mean like you guys go all out. A lot of the traditions that are associated with Halloween were actually brought over by Scottish and Irish immigrants during the 19th century. And then once they came over to America, a lot of these practices were adopted and adapted slightly, and sort of they started spreading to other countries around the 20th century. Now, whilst we generally associate Halloween with costumes, decorations, trick-or-treatings, horror, sort of in general, it is part of a Western Christian holiday known as All Hallowtide, which runs over 3 days. So you have Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, which is on October 31st. Then you have All Saints Day, or All Hallows Day, or Hallowmas, which is on November 1st. And then you have November 2nd, which is All Souls Day. Now, All Hallowtide is a sort of festival in which to remember and honour the dead. This included like martyrs and saints and just the souls of the faithful departed. The word All Hallowtide was first used all the way back in 1471 and it's comprised of 3 separate words, all from Old English. So you have the word hallow, which means holy. You then have the word tide, meaning time or season, and all, meaning all. Now, hallow and saint are actually synonyms for each other, which is why it's sometimes referred to as All Saints Day, other times All Hallows Day, and it's why when people say like hallowed ground, it's like holy ground. And obviously Halloween or All Hallows Eve is the evening before. Now, within Christianity, honouring the dead was particularly important, especially when it came to martyrs. And originally in like the early church, feast days were held on an individual basis and sort of in local instances for each martyr. However, during the persecution of Christians during the Roman Empire, basically they ran out of days. They ended up with more martyrs than there were days in the year, so they decided to hold an individual day to honour all of them. So it originally started out as All Hallows Day or All Saints Day, and then the vigil of All Hallows Eve from the night before. The third day was then added as All Saints Day, just to honour the souls of the dead in general. First side note of the video, because I looked it up, a vigil is described as a period of purposeful sleeplessness and an occasion of devotional watching, and it's obviously therefore generally used to mean like evening, because obviously I've heard of like candlelit vigils before, and I know they're generally held in the evening or at night. I just never knew that it was like you deliberately stay up to have this vigil this evening. Now, the origins of All Hallowtide itself are thought to actually have originated as a ritualistic remembrance of the Great Flood, Noah's Ark, that kind of thing. But the idea was that the first night was in remembrance of the wickedness of the world before the flood. The second night celebrated those who were saved by it and survived the flood. And then the third night was to celebrate those who would then go on to repopulate the earth. That in particular is not like a confirmed thing, it's more just a theory, but I just found it interesting that even back then, the Halloween aspect of that trio was associated with like wickedness and sin, and then obviously the associations nowadays with like horror and things like that. It was an interesting parallel to me. Not that I'm saying horror movies and that are sinful, but you know what I mean. Now, the origins of All Hallows Eve in particular is a heavily debated topic, with some scholars maintaining that Christians came up with the idea themselves and completely independent of anyone else or any other cultures or religions. It's argued by a lot of people, and it's generally becoming more and more accepted that a lot of the practices and traditions associated with All Hallows Eve were absorbed by the Christian church from the Celtic practices associated with a festival known as, bear with me on this pronunciation, Samhain? Okay, my bad. I think it's pronounced Samhain. Please feel free to correct me on that pronunciation, because I am trying really hard to get it right. I believe it's pronounced Sound, but it's spelt like this. But it's believed that the church were attempting to sort of Christianize the celebration in order to ease the Celts' conversion to Christianity. Now, Samhain itself is fascinating. It was an ancient Celtic festival observed by pagans, held on November 1st, and it marked the end of autumn and the beginning of winter. It was the end of harvest. The festival is actually mentioned in some of the earliest examples of Irish literature, dating back to the 9th century, and it is actually associated with a lot of very important events throughout Irish mythology in general. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole looking into that, because there's so many Irish folklore stories that centre around this festival and this date, lots of traditions that happened. Now, the earliest records showed that this festival was marked by these like great big feasts and big gatherings of people, and it was known as a liminal or threshold festival, which is where the boundaries between this world and the other world were blurred. And obviously in Irish mythology, the other world is this place of like everlasting beauty and youth, and it's the domain of a lot of like gods and deity figures. During this festival, it's believed that the ancient burial mounds dotted throughout Ireland, I've been informed that it's pronounced she, not side or sids. She? The ancient burial mounds throughout Ireland were open because they were seen as like portals to the other world. Now, a lot of the actual details of this festival weren't recorded until a lot closer to the modern era. Said details included a lot of sort of general harvest time practices, things like cattle being brought in from the summertime pastures, certain livestock being slaughtered in preparation for the winter, things like that. But a lot of the practices recorded for this festival sound very, very familiar to what we often associate with Halloween nowadays, and it is often believed that this festival in particular is the origin for a lot of those behaviours, those traditions. Now, some of the practices that marked this festival that, as I said, can be seen quite heavily associated with Halloween in the modern age. Things like special bonfires being lit because it was believed that they had both protective and cleansing powers. And these protective powers were especially relevant because whilst it was believed the portals to the other world were open, it meant that making contact with spirits or fairies was a lot more likely to happen. Now, during the festival, these particular fairies and spirits, which a lot of scholars believed are like remnants of ancient pagan gods, these spirits and fairies were often appeased with offerings of food or drink in order to ensure that people lived and survived through the winter along with their livestock and things like that. It was also believed that on this particular night when these portals were open, the souls of family members or kin who had passed away would return to the home, so it became a customary tradition to set a place for them at the table. And this belief in particular is actually found in a very large number of different countries and different cultures, like all across the world. And it's believed that this aspect in particular has like super ancient origins. Now, divination was a huge part of this festival as well, and it presented itself in various different forms, but it was usually to try and gain insight into one's future, particularly in relation to like death and marriages and things like that. Among these sort of games and acts of divination, apples and hazelnuts were most commonly used. Within Celtic mythology, apples are very strongly associated with the other world and immortality, whereas hazelnuts are associated with divine wisdom. Now, speaking of apples, can you guess what one of the most common games of divination was? Well, I'm going to tell you anyway. It was apple bobbing. The belief was, when it came to sort of divination, that if you were able to grab an apple during apple bobbing, or I think it was also referred to as like dunking, but the belief was that if you were able to grab an apple, whoever it belonged to would be your future spouse. On a side note, before it was associated with Samhain, apple bobbing was adopted and kind of merged from Romans with Celtic celebrations. So it was when the Roman army merged their own celebrations with traditional Celtic festivals, and during an annual celebration, young unmarried people would try to bite into an apple floating on water or hanging from a string, and the first person who was able to successfully bite into it would be the next one who was allowed to marry. Even though the Romans got it from merging their own celebrations with Celtic festivals, it was later appropriated into Samhain, as apples were also a sign of like fertility and sort of abundance, hence the association with marriage and spousal and that side of things. It was also said that a maiden who placed the apple that she had bobbed under her pillow would then dream of her future sweetheart. In a similar vein to apple bobbing, but more in keeping with what I read as being like the Roman version of it, another game that was played involved hanging a small wooden rod from the ceiling with a lit candle on one end and an apple hanging off a bit of string on the other end. The rod was then spun round and everyone took turns trying to catch the apple with their teeth. The more I thought about that, I don't know logistically how that would work in terms of like whether the apple hung a lot lower than the candle or what, but I had this vision of someone trying to take a bite of the apple and then just getting a face full of candle. There was another practice that they did that I've also seen referred to as an apple wedding, and it's basically where you would take an apple and you would peel the skin off in just one long strand. You then toss the peel over your shoulder, either into a bucket of water or just on the floor. The peel would then form a letter which would reveal the initial of your future spouse. Because I remember seeing that in a really old episode of Charmed when I was a kid, and for some reason it stuck with me, because I remember thinking at the time, like, unless your spouse's name begins with like a C or an O, I don't know how many other letters an apple peel is really gonna make. Another form of divination involved taking 2 hazelnuts and roasting them by an open flame, the idea being that one of the hazelnuts was named after the person who was doing the roasting, and the other hazelnut was named after the person that they desired. And the belief that followed that was that if the 2 hazelnuts like jumped apart from each other or like jumped away from the flames, it signified that it was a bad match. But if they just sat there roasting quietly, it signified that it was a good match. And that one in particular really reminded me of, like, do you remember those like playground games you used to play where it was like little fortune tellers? You'd have the paper thing where you'd do and it had like numbers, or it would reveal your fortune, that kind of thing. But it also really reminded me of like the earlier days of the internet, where you'd get those like crush calculator things, where it's like you type in your name and you type in the name of your crush and like maybe a few other details, and then it would like calculate how compatible you were with each other and give you like a percentage. Like obviously that especially was all bogus, but it just really reminded me of that, like using these sort of divination senses to work out whether you should be with someone. So I found that quite fascinating. There was also a practice of hiding items in food, such as like cakes and things like that, and then it would be served out to people at random, and whatever item you found within your bit of food was tied into the prediction of your future. So for example, if you found a ring, it would signify marriage. If you found a coin, it signified wealth, that kind of thing. There was another example that I saw that it really caught my attention for being so unbelievably specific. Like, the amount of steps that were involved in it was kind of insane. So it was basically a salty oatmeal bannock. I think it's pronounced bannock. It's like a type of flatbread, was baked. Someone would then eat it in 3 bites, then go to bed in silence without having anything to drink, and this was said to result in a dream in which their future spouse would offer them a drink. Okay, I'd love to know who put all the steps together to form that one. I'm gonna be honest, that one feels a bit more like, you know, some of the remedies that people suggest when you have hiccups, like drinking from the wrong side of a cup or standing on your head for 10 seconds and things like that. There was a Calvin and Hobbes comic strip years ago where he was giving him all these suggestions of like how to get rid of hiccups, and then he generally said towards the end of it, it seems like a lot of those remedies were just thought of to entertain the other person. And it's like, that particular practice of eating this really salty flatbread without a drink and then just going to bed, it just, I don't know, it seems too specific. I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole with this because divination in itself is fascinating because there's a lot of blurred lines between, I think, sort of divination and almost superstition. There was other things like people would drop egg whites into water and the shapes that it made would predict the number of future children you would have. Young people would chase crows and like they would determine aspects of their future based on things like the number of birds that were there or what direction they flew in. And it reminded me of like the little rhyme that goes along with whenever you see a magpie. I remember my granddad teaching me that rhyme when I was a kid, and it stuck with me. I still say that rhyme to myself every time I see a magpie now. Now, going back to the liminal aspect of the Samhain festival, it was a kind of unwritten rule that people would generally take great care not to offend the spirits or fairies that had made their way through the boundaries between worlds. And generally speaking, people would try and sort of ward off anyone who was out to cause mischief. Whilst they had these like great gatherings and feasts and things like that, people would generally try and stay quite close to their home if they could. Or if they did have to walk out into the darkness, there was a practice of turning your clothes inside out or carrying iron and salt in your pockets to keep the spirits away. And obviously it's interesting because iron and salt are obviously very commonly associated with the paranormal, ghosts, spirits nowadays, that kind of thing. And it's a very ancient practice of those particular items being used to ward off paranormal evil spirits. Now, in Southern Ireland, it was a custom to weave a small cross together of like sticks and straw, and it was called a partial, but people would make them at the Samhain festival, and then you place them on doorways to ward off bad luck, evil spirits and witchcraft, sickness, that kind of thing. And then at the next Samhain festival, you would replace it with a new one. Samhain also had a tradition that was originally referred to as mumming or guising, in which people went door to door wearing costumes, reciting verses and songs in exchange for food. And it's believed that the costumes may have been a way of disguising yourself from the spirits and the fairies that were present. Now, the tradition of guising does actually come from Ireland and Scotland, and as I'm sure you can guess, it is generally believed to be the origin for what we now know as trick-or-treating. But guising specifically was the act of children going door to door in disguise, being given a gift of food or coin or apples and nuts for the Halloween party. In Ireland and Scotland as well, Halloween masks were referred to as false faces, and I believe in certain parts of Ireland and Scotland they are still referred to as false faces. Now, in Scotland, youths would go house to house, usually wearing like veils or face coverings, or in some instances they had used the ash from the bonfires to sort of blacken out their faces. And again, this was used as a protective measure against the spirits and fairies that were said to be roaming around. And these particular youths would often recite poetry or rhymes or verses, and they would often threaten to do mischief if they were not welcomed in or given gifts. Now, guising in Scotland has been recorded since like the 16th century, but it was originally generally only done during the New Year. But in 1895, there was a record of guising at Halloween, which described masqueraders in disguise carrying lanterns made of scooped out turnips, visiting homes to be rewarded with cakes and fruit and money. And in Ireland, with guising, children would often use the phrase, "help the Halloween party," when they knocked on the doors. There are some links and beliefs that guising itself originated from yet another tradition in which people impersonated the souls of the dead to accept and receive offerings on their behalf. And again, it's one of those instances where it was believed that impersonating these spirits and these souls offered protection from them. And as I said in the other case, by impersonating them, you were disguising yourself sort of amongst them so they wouldn't hurt you. Now, when it came to impersonating these spirits, it was a bit of a grey area that bordered the line between guising and playing pranks, because playing pranks at Samhain is recorded in the Scottish Highlands as far back as like 1736. It led to Samhain actually being nicknamed as Mischief Night, which is now its own whole separate thing. Mischief Night is considered on October 30th, so the night before Halloween, and in some areas it's actually referred to as Devil's Night. Now, I'd heard of Devil's Night before, I didn't know where it came from. Side note as well, Mischief Night is its whole own separate thing because it started out as like very, very harmless pranks. That's where things like toilet papering houses and throwing eggs and stuff like that, that's where all that kind of thing came from. But in certain areas, Mischief Night devolved into sort of petty crimes, and I think there was somewhere in like Detroit in particular that it had like really bad cases of arson associated with Devil's Night. So again, I think Devil's Night in particular is much more of an American thing. It's more Mischief Night over here. But again, it was a really fascinating little kind of tangent to go down. The idea of wearing costumes and playing pranks on Halloween spread to England in the 20th century. And as I said before, during the time of like mass transatlantic immigration from Ireland and Scotland over to America, costumes and pranks were a very strong tradition within Halloween and Samhain festivals. It then became very popularised in America, and obviously from there it's just exploded. Now, the earliest known recorded instance of guising at Halloween in North America was from 1911 from a newspaper in Canada, and the origin of the phrase trick-or-treat is believed to have come from central Canada before then spreading to the northern and western United States in sort of the 1930s. Now, there is some belief that trick-or-treating, especially in relation to sort of like candy and chocolates and sweets, that it was an adult intervention in order to discourage people from taking part in like mischief night vandalism, basically bribing them to behave. Whilst it's an amusing little side note, there aren't really that many reports or studies that kind of support that, apart from one area. So there is an area in Iowa that genuinely does have a record of trick-or-treating being used to deter crime. Because I originally read somewhere that, you know, the two were linked, and it was the people saying trick-or-treat threatening to cause mischief if they weren't given the treat, and then people were like, okay, we'll give you the treat as long as you don't. Like, it was almost like a chicken and egg situation as to which one came first. But as amusing as that would be, it's not proven to be the case. A lot of adults in America actually saw it more as like a form of extortion, and especially when it started spreading to other countries. So between the sort of like 30s and 50s, newspaper reportings of this trick-or-treating act, a lot of adults didn't really agree with it and they were confused by it. Some of them got a bit angry about it because, like I said, they saw it as a form of extortion. I remember when I was a kid, my first and only experience of trick-or-treating, there was one particular house we went to where the woman answered and just immediately said, I don't believe in trick-or-treating, it's an American thing, it shouldn't be here, and then just closed the door on us. That was fun for me. Now again, going back to the festival of Samhain and the tradition of guising, it was part of the tradition that the guisers or the pranksters would carry around turnips or mangel-wurzels, which are apparently a root vegetable in the same family as like beetroot. Never heard of them before, but they carried those around hollowed out, acting as lanterns. Usually they were carved with like really grotesque faces as well. The turnip heads were also placed on windowsills and in doorways, and it was said to represent the spirits and souls of these like supernatural beings. And once again, it was used as a way of warding off these evil spirits. So people would go around in these costumes with these lanterns so that as they're wandering around house to house, it would ward off the spirits that had entered through the open portals. Now, the use of turnips carved out and hollowed out with faces as a way of illuminating the path and as a way of warding off evil spirits comes from yet another tale of Irish folklore that is known as the legend of Stingy Jack. I'll be honest, I'd never heard of this legend before, but I absolutely love it. It is fascinating, it's kind of amusing, if I'm being completely honest. And again, it's just another example of particularly Irish folklore that has just had this really widespread impact and connotations with it. The Irish really did come up with a lot. Now, with regards to the actual legend itself, I found like two versions. One is the generally told one, and the other one was published in a journal in 1836. Now, this iteration, again, I'd never heard this one before, and it was only this one reference that I found to it, so I'll just briefly go over the story of that one first. So in that particular tale, the story is that this man named Jack helped an old man, and this old man was revealed to be an angel. The angel then grants Jack 3 wishes as a reward for helping him, but Jack decides to use these 3 wishes to punish anyone who sits in his chair, punish anyone who tries to take wood from his home, and anyone who tries to take his like cobbling tools, he fixed them to the ground so that they couldn't. Now, the angel is none too happy about this and very disappointed in Jack, bars him from entering heaven. Jack later on then manages to deflect messengers of Satan who are trying to like trick him, which means that he doesn't go to hell either, and he's condemned to roam the world in neither heaven or hell. Now, the more generally told legend, which is the one that I saw reference to the most, and the more accepted version of the legend, I guess, is along a similar vein, but slightly less angel-y, more Satan-y. So the legend goes that centuries ago in Ireland, there was a man named Jack who was a drunkard and a manipulator and a liar, and he was just known for like deceiving people and playing tricks on them and just generally being not a very nice man. Satan himself overheard tales of Jack's like evil deeds and silvered tongue and went out himself to see if the rumours were true. So one night, which was believed to be Halloween, Jack is stumbling home, drunk obviously, and he comes across a body lying on the road. The body that he found was said to have this like really eerie demeanour and really creepy grimace, and the body was in fact Satan himself. So Jack realised it was Satan, realised that it was the end, you know, Satan had come to collect his soul, take him to hell, so he made one last request and asked if the devil would allow him one last drink of ale before he was taken to hell. Now, the devil didn't particularly think anything of this, so he said, yep, sure, fine. So he took him to a local pub where he allowed him to have several more drinks. Jack then threw Satan a bit of a curveball that Satan was not expecting, because Jack asked Satan to pay the tab, stating that he didn't carry any money on him. As an example of just how good Jack was at manipulating people, he managed to convince the devil to turn himself into a silver coin that he could use to pay his tab to the bartender, and that Satan could just turn himself back when no one was looking. Now, Satan, being actually quite impressed by Jack's like nefarious tactics, agreed and turned himself into a coin. However, Jack did not use the coin to pay the tab. Jack instead put the coin in his pocket, but inside his pocket there was a crucifix, and the proximity of the crucifix meant that Satan could not return to his original form. Jack then coerced the devil into making a deal. Jack would release him and allow him to return to his original form if Satan granted him 10 more years before he came to collect his soul. Now, the devil, not really having any choice in the matter, agreed, so Jack released him and they parted ways. 10 years later, Jack came upon the devil again in the same setting, again Halloween night, and he seemed to accept that it was his time to go. But he again made one last request. This time he asked for an apple to fill his belly before he went to hell. Now, despite having been tricked by Jack in this exact same scenario 10 years prior, the devil, for whatever reason, agreed to his request. So Satan climbed a nearby tree to retrieve an apple for Jack, but while he was up in this tree, surprise surprise, Jack put a load of crucifixes around the base of the tree, trapping him there. Kind of like a cliched cat. Right, I'm actually very nearly finished with this makeup and also very nearly finished with the story. So let me just go and do all the last bits, fill in these bits and do the finishing touches, and then I'll be back and we can finish the tale of Stingy Jack and the story of Halloween in general. Hello, we're back. I don't know why it looks so much creepier with the lenses in. Just to very quickly explain the turtleneck and the reason I haven't painted my actual neck is I was kind of basing this look off this guy, or this meme. I knew I wanted to do like a pumpkin-esque look for this video, but I kind of wasn't really sure how to, like, beyond just the pumpkin face, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with like the hair or the outfit, and then I remembered this meme exists, so I thought it would just be like a fun little thing. Anywho, finishing off quickly the legend of Stingy Jack. I've done that thing where I can't remember where I got to in the story. I think Satan was stuck in a tree. So yeah, Jack had convinced Satan to get him an apple. Satan had gone up into a tree. Jack had then placed crucifixes around the base of the tree, trapping Satan in the tree. And once again, Jack used this position of power that he was in to coerce the devil into yet another deal. In this instance, he said he would let Satan go if Satan agreed to never take his soul to hell. And Satan, again, not really having much of a choice in this scenario, agreed. So again, he let Satan go and carried on drinking and lying and being his mischievous little self. Now eventually Jack's lifestyle did catch up to him and he would die. And while his soul was preparing to go up and enter heaven, he reached the pearly gates, but he was denied entry. God told him that because of his drinking and his sinful lifestyle, he was not allowed into heaven. So Jack decided to go down to the gates of hell, figuring that, you know, even hell would be better than wandering between the two for eternity, and he begged Satan to let his soul in. However, holding up his end of the bargain, Satan refused him entry because, hey, this was your bargain, you made me agree not to take your soul. So he was denied entry from both heaven and hell. Satan did give Jack an ember from the fires of hell to use as a way to illuminate his path, and Jack ended up placing this inside a hollowed out turnip, where he was then doomed to forever roam the earth between the worlds of heaven and hell. From this legend, it was believed that you could sometimes see the glow from his lantern, like off in the distance, especially on Halloween night, and the Irish began to refer to him as Jack of the Lantern, or Jack-o'-lantern for short. Now, interesting little side note to this, the sightings of his lantern are actually quite associated with something called will-o'-wisps, or will-o'-the-wisp. It's like this atmospheric, ghostly light apparition kind of thing, usually seen by travellers at night, especially over like bogs and swamps and marshes and stuff. Now, a lot of modern science has been able to attribute this sort of natural light phenomena to things like bioluminescence and the expulsion of gases that then sort of react with the light and create this illusion of like a coloured flame. But in folklore especially, they're said to mislead travellers by resembling a flickering lamp or lantern like in the distance. And these like will-o'-wisp things have been recorded in tales and legends from numerous different countries and cultures. It's one of those, it's like an aspect of folklore that spans a whole range of individual stories and tales. It's not one specific thing. Following on from this legend, people did start making their own versions of Jack's lantern by carving scary faces into turnips, where they would be placed on the windowsill or the doorframe of the house to frighten away Stingy Jack on Halloween night. Obviously being very heavily associated within Ireland, once this tradition travelled over to America, along with a lot of all the other Halloween traditions, it was found that pumpkins, which were native to America, so in abundance, were obviously a lot larger and a lot softer than turnips, and therefore significantly easier to carve, and as such, the tradition of carving pumpkins began. But so brings us to the end of the tale of Stingy Jack and the various legends of Halloween, or All Hallows Eve. Let me know what you guys think. Do you celebrate Halloween? What traditions and practices do you guys do? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd be really interested to know how different people interpret and celebrate Halloween, if you do celebrate it at all. Let me know what you think of the look as well. I am okay with it, I think. I think the vision is there, kind of. Let me know what other creatures, stories, myths and legends you want me to cover. Keep an eye out for all the content that I've got coming out over the next month, because there's a lot. As I said though, there will be some special editions of my Monsters, Myths and Makeup series, so I'm really excited to share those with you. Otherwise, I hope you have a fabulous day. I am very appreciative to all of you, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!